I want to thank you for joining me today. Today's workshop, we'll be going over front-end foundations. We'll be looking mainly at lesson 2. Essentially, we're going to look at JavaScript objects and using the this keyword. So we'll just take a closer look at objects, what we use them for, and kind of practice around with them. If you have any questions throughout, please go ahead and unmute yourself and just ask the question. Once I share my screen, I cannot see the chat. So if you could just unmute yourself, ask the question, and don't be shy. I'm sure someone else in the room has the same question if you're having it as well. So let's go ahead and begin. Can everyone see this all right?
Yes, I can see it.
Awesome. All right, so what I have here is a script file here, a JavaScript file, and we are asked to create an object. So the object needs to have the following properties and a method. So it's asking us to create an object named Charlie with the following properties. It has a student ID of 1, has a name is Charles Smith, the age, address, phone number, and then we have an is enrolled property that is equal to true. And then lastly, we want a method called greeting that console logs the following message. Here we have, hi, I am, and then when we see something like this, that means we want to replace it with this instance's property of name. So essentially we want this to read, hi, I am Charles Smith, and I am, replace the age variable with the instance's value of age, 35 years old, I live on, and then, excuse me, we'll replace address with the instance of this address. Okay, so when we're creating an object in JavaScript, we're going to do it like we treat other variables. We do var, and we want this to be called Charlie, and then we're going to set it equal to a set of curly brackets. And what those curly brackets are doing is putting all the properties together. So here, our first property is going to be student ID. And these properties can have primitive values. So basically what that means is the different data types. Number, string, Boolean, things of that nature. So in this case, where I want student ID to equal 1, what data type would that be?
That would be a number.
Yep, it would be a number. So how would I write that?
Just the word number?
Yep, just like that.
Oh, okay.
So when we have the data type number, we're just writing the number. I want to point out the difference between that and this. When we have 1 in quotations, we're talking about a string. And a string is basically anything that can be represented on the keyboard. So any of these characters that you see on your keyboard is essentially a character that would be represented as a string, as the data type. So since student ID is number, I'm just going to leave out the quotes and just put the number. Then we're going to separate each property by commas. So then to make things look nice, I'll go ahead and go to the second line, and then we have the property name, which would have the data type of what? If we wanted to equal Charles Smith, what would our data type be?
String.
String. And how would I write it?
Quotation and then Charles Smith. Quotation.
Exactly. Perfect. So here we have the data type string, and we represented it with quotations. And then we'll go ahead and move on. So then we have age, which is a number, so we'll write it, 35. We have address that I'm going to make as a string because I have a combination of numbers and characters. And then we have phone. Phone could be a little bit tricky here. I'm going to do it as a string because I have the dashes and that is a character and it's not a number. I could make it data type number if I left out the dashes, but I want special formatting on this, so I am just going to represent it as a string. And then lastly, we have is enrolled, and I want that to equal true. So what data type is that?
A Boolean?
Yep, exactly. So we have true. Now, when we're doing Booleans, we just write the word true or false. That's how it can tell that it's a Boolean. If you put this in quotations, this is the string true. So it's just a bunch of characters that we've put together. That's how the computer reads it. It doesn't read the fact that this says true, so it's not going to interpret it as a Boolean. So we need to just write the word true on its own. So here we have the properties of this object Charlie, and we have some values there. Now the last thing it asks us to do is to create a method called greeting that console logs a message. Okay, so when I am doing a method, I give it its name, greeting, and then I'm going to tell it what it is. So here we say, hey, these are the values and these are the data types, right? Implicitly, we say what data types they are. Here, I'm going to say, I'm writing a function, okay? I want this to do something. So this property greeting is a function. So overall, it's a method for the object Charlie. And then you're just going to write a function like you normally do. Normally, when you write a function, you would have function, greeting, and then it would look like this here. But here we have it inverse because we're dealing with the property greeting and we're saying it is a function. And then these parentheses are the same parentheses here. So if it required any perimeters, then we would put that there, but we don't need any perimeters here. So I just want to point out the syntax of writing a method for a object here. All right, so now we are going to, what do we want this method greeting to do? I want to console.log a message, okay? So this message, I want to replace these with the actual name of this object, right? So this is where the this keyword comes into play, okay? So here I'm just going to begin writing my string. Hi, I am, and then we need to add this variable. So there's two ways of writing this. I could write it like this dot name, and then keep adding my string, or I can use interpolation and just put the variable inside of the string, so I don't have to use a bunch of plus signs. And I do that by doing the dollar symbol with curly brackets and then putting my variable name inside of those curly brackets. Okay, so you can write them either way. This one saves you a lot more keystrokes, and if you're writing code all day, you know that any keystroke saved is always nice. And it's just a cleaner way of writing it as well. But here, this, I know this can be kind of confusing. Why are we saying this? Why aren't we just saying Charlie.name? Because that's the name of my object. Well, what this is doing is referring to this particular instance that we're talking about, this object. So let's say that I had a global variable Charlie up here, right? Let's pretend there's a bunch of code, and I had another Charlie variable and it equaled a new instance of a person class or something like that, right? Let's just pretend. I'm not going to write out the whole code, right? So when we are doing Charlie.name here, it could be changing the global variable, right? So this is why we also want to kind of avoid global variables. But it's not necessarily referring to this Charlie, right? There could be some hang up in our code. Maybe we have different variables named Charlies used for different purposes, or whatever it might be. So we use this keyword to keep things safe, but also to keep things clean. So we're saying, I'm looking at this object, the object that I am currently in. The object that is currently in is Charlie, and Charlie's .name property is Charles Smith. Okay, so that's why we use the this keyword. This is, you kind of talk to any developer about the this keyword, there's 1,000,001 explanations, and it's kind of hard to conceptualize in words. But are there any questions on the object, the property, using the this keyword before we continue?
Yeah, I have a question. When do we use a semicolon versus a comma at the end of, like, when we, like, you know, you put name Charles Smith, comma, H?
Yeah, so you can kind of think of semicolons when you are doing something that's executable, something that has an action. So like when I say, let's pretend I write the rest of this console log here, I would normally put a semicolon there, right? Because this is an executable action. I am doing something here. In this, I'm not really doing anything. I'm just defining the different properties and values of the Charlie object. So there, you can kind of think, okay, am I doing an action? If so, they're more than likely you're going to need a semicolon. And that's what kind of helps me remember where I need a semicolon and where I don't. But that also takes a lot of time and practice to remember.
What are the different, one is called string interpolation. That is where you do plus and then the property, right? What's the other one called with the $sign?
So this one is interpolation, and the plus is concatenation.
Ah, okay. So when one does the interpolation, does one need a backtick, or is the double quotes, is that okay?
I believe the double quotes should be fine in JavaScript, but we can test it and be just to make sure. I would have to double check the syntax on that, but I believe double quotes will work. We'll find out in just a second.
Okay.
So, okay, can you explain the $sign? Like,
yes.
what?
So what we're doing here with the $sign and the curly brackets, we're saying, hey, I'm inputting a variable in here. I'm taking the value of this variable and I'm putting it inside of this string. So then what you put inside of the curly brackets is that actual variable. So if I had something here like name equals Sue and I console.log, we would do name because that's the variable. So basically, instead of having to write, let me just copy and paste this. Oops. In order for us to do this, we have to kind of take a few extra steps here. So this is basically going to output the same thing. All we're doing is basically what this is replacing that plus, those two plus signs.
Okay.
Any other
Can you
questions?
put the money symbol outside of the quotes in the string, and what effect would that have?
You'll probably get an error there. We can test it out and see what the error message might be, or if an error message occurs. But yeah,
I assume they wouldn't be right, but
I'm not 100% what the actual output would be. Sometimes JavaScript is funny too, and it's not technically right, and it will output what you want it to output. So it's always good to test it out. So let's go ahead and actually test this out and start getting some questions answered here that I'm not 100% on. So let's continue this and if I wanted to put age here, then I would have the $sign and the curly brackets, age. And I'm just going to type this really quickly.
Why did you put age instead of this.age?
Because I did it wrong, so good catch. This dot address. All right. Okay, so I wrote that fast, and this is why it's always good to slow down and make sure that you are writing what you want. So let's take a look here. I am, and then we're importing this variable, this instant, this object's property name, and I am this object's property age years old, and I live on this object's property address. All right, so that looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and test this out. So I am going to call on Charlie.greeting. Okay. So then I'm going to go ahead, and there's a couple ways you can test out your code for JavaScript. You can connect it to HTML. You can create an index.html file and then connect your script to that HTML file. And we can open this up in a browser. And then open up the console in that browser by right-clicking and going to inspect. And then going to our console and seeing what the result is. But there is no result there. So then let's go back here and see what went wrong.
I think you have to save the file.
Oh, did I not save it? Looks saved. Yeah, it is there. And there's no error messages. So let's go with the, yep, you were right. It is a backtick. All right, so we had a question earlier that do we need to do the backticks or the double quotes? For JavaScript, you have to use the backticks in order to import these variables. So if you see my coloring changed here, and we can now clearly see that this is the correct syntax for this. So I apologize for that, but even experts mess up sometimes. All right, so let's go ahead and let's retest this. Let's go ahead and refresh. And we are not getting a result. There we go. I forgot my parentheses there. I'm gonna go ahead and refresh, and now we have our result. All right, so let's take a look because there were some errors and I kind of debugged them quickly. So the first error that we had was we didn't get a result, right? So there are going to be times where you are going to not get any error messages, and you're also not going to get your code to work. So it's going to be hard to decide, okay, where are things going wrong? So at that point, you need to look at your code and kind of, I like to talk out loud. I sound kind of crazy at my computer, but I talk out loud and I say my code out loud to see if it makes sense. Okay, so as I'm going through here, I see that I list out my properties, and I didn't write that much code, so there's not much to go through. And I see that my syntax looks all right, or so I think. So I would go ahead and check the syntax of this, and everything looks good. And then someone pointed out that this should be backticks instead of double quotes. So I got my languages a little bit mixed up here. So here, in order to use interpolation in JavaScript, we need to use backticks instead of double quotes. And that's also helpful, why it's helpful to use an IDE sometimes, because the coloring kind of helps you realize if your syntax is on and off. But don't use this as a strict ruling. Like the coloring, it's not always exactly right. So don't use it as like, oh, the coloring is not exactly right, but it is somewhat helpful. So here I realized that the syntax was off, okay? And then I reran my code and I still didn't get a result. Okay, so I know that this is debugged and this is all good, but I am seeing here that I am calling on greeting, but greeting is a function. And when we have a function, we need to indicate that putting our parentheses here. So the parentheses here indicate that we're calling on this function, and there are 0 parameters, so we leave that blank. And then finally, we go ahead and get a result. So throughout that entire process, I did not get any error messages, but I still had to do some debugging. So when you are working on your code and you run into any issues like that, first thing I always look at is syntax, and then I always say my code out loud. If you have any trouble while you're debugging or with that method, just let me know and I'd be happy to help you. But are there any questions on creating objects, properties in objects, creating a function, the this keyword, anything that we've gone over today?
I have a question. Why were you because you put the greeting function inside that variable. So that I mean, I don't understand how that works. And then you're able to call it inside that same variable.
So you can kind of think of it as another property for this object. So kind of like there's certain actions that you can take. Are you familiar with basketball? That's a silly question, I feel like, but how basketball works?
I am.
Okay. So imagine that you have a forward in basketball and he has different properties, right? He's tall, he can jump, things like that. And then an action that you could do is jumping or rebounding. So there are certain actions that are tied to a particular object that may not be tied to other objects. So greeting is just another property of the Charlie object. Charlie, as an object, has the ability to greet. Does that make things a little bit clearer, or did I?
Yes.
Okay.
That actually made things very clear for me. I understand sports analogies.
Okay, cool. Perfect. Any other questions? I see some messages in the chat here popping up.
I have a question back on the other screen. Can you go over what the difference between the element and the console log? Like element?
Yeah. Yep. So elements is referring to HTML elements. So that would be, I didn't have any HTML elements. I just had my HTML skeleton. So if we look at my HTML, I mean, technically I have, my body element and my head element and things like that, but there's nothing really in the body. So those elements are referring to your HTML elements. So if I had an H1 tag, let me save this. And I could select an element, that's the element it's referring to, the HTML elements. The console is basically, it's kind of like a log for you to use in JavaScript. So it's not anything on the browser. It's incorporated in Google's developer tools. But the console is basically a way for you to check your code. So it's really a debugging tool. I know in the curriculum we see a lot of console.log, but that's so that we can show you what your code is doing and so you can check the result. And that's essentially what that console is, that log that we can use to, run a string or see if a particular code works or, a chance for us to debug our code. So that's what that console log is doing there. Which actually brings up a point here. I wanted to show you a different way that you could test this. So I had mentioned that one way was through the browser. We add an HTML page, and then we open it in the browser, then we open up our inspection tools, and then we go to the console. So there's a lot of steps involved there. Another thing that you can do is use Node. So in lesson 1, it requires you to download Node and NPM. Once you've done that, you can open up your integrated terminal on VS Code. So you can do Control backtick to open it up, or you can go up here click on View, and then click Terminal. Okay. Once that is open, it will open in the directory that you're currently working in. So here we have the directory I'm in, and then I can run the command node with a space followed by the name of my script file, so script.js. And now this is treated as a console. So you can go ahead and test your code right in VS Code. You don't have to bring in HTML if you don't have to. I'm sorry, Annette, that was a really long-winded answer. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
What about functions that are defined without the function keyword, like the ones that use the fat arrow?
I'm
What's
sorry,
inside of that?
you kind of cut out in the middle of your question. So you were asking about defining a function with the arrow, like an arrow function?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. So are you asking about the syntax for that, or I'm not understanding?
What I was curious is if you had, for your method of greeting, if you had written that as an arrow function, how would you access the object properties? Because I know that in some functions, the keyword this changes scope.
Well, with an arrow function, since we're still in the scope of the definition of this object, it would still be okay. So then you would just write it like that. So basically what this is saying is we're writing a generic function. And then the syntax would change, but it would still result in the same because we're still in the scope of this object. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I just thought that this keyword would have a different meaning inside of that arrow function.
No, not in this arrow function, because since we are in the scope of the object, so overall this definition of greeting is another property of this object. So this arrow function still absorbs the scope of everything else in here. Now, if I had a function down here that we had const greeting something like this, and then we had a console log, and I'm just gonna save me some typing here, then this would have a different result, because what we're looking at, there's nothing tied to this, right? This isn't attached to any particular instance or object. But if we had some, like an object, here, let me make a new object here. Now, let's pretend we're just looking at this example right here. Then I could use this greeting for this instance. Actually, let me just double check that and make sure that is correct. Yeah, okay, no, it's an error. Yeah, so here, when we take it outside of the object definition, when we take it outside of the object definition, this keyword isn't tied to any kind of instance, right? I would have to pass in that object, Alex, and then we can refer to this instance. But if I were to leave it empty like that, this has no value. So I would have to pass in Alex when I called it. So it would actually look like this. But that kind of gets into deeper JavaScript, because then I would have to pass in that object here. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Stefan? I think we lost him. But I hope that makes sense. So when we have it in here in the actual object definition, this holds some value because we're talking about an actual instance of that object. There's something I can hold on to, that's something that's tangible. When I take it out, this is not referring to anything. What is this? There is no this. I would have to pass in that object and then refer to it. But that kind of gets into a little bit more advanced JavaScript, which I don't want to get into because I don't want to cause confusion. But that's essentially what you would have to do if you were to take it outside. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, cool, perfect. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. When do we like? I've heard that you can use var or let. When would you use var or versus let?
So let was introduced later on, and basically everything's kind of gearing towards let because the difference is that it doesn't take up space and memory. So let is kind of a temporary variable. Like you would use let and, okay, I only use it for this amount of time, like in this function or in this block or in this part of my code. So it doesn't allocate memory space, so that's when you would use let, where var is something that you would use like on a global scope, but you don't essentially ever want to do global scope. You want to avoid that as much as possible. But yeah, that's pretty much the main difference there. As far as like functionality is defining a variable, it works the same way. It's just really a memory thing.
Okay.
But I would use let because that's where everyone's going.
Heading.
Yes. I just show var because that's in the curriculum so that you can see it being used. Any other questions? All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I do want to thank you for your time and joining me today. If you have any feedback, please let me know. Also, if you have any requests for workshop topics, please let me know. I'm very open and receptive. I would love to hear from you as well. This is recorded and posted. You can find it on your announcements where it says workshop library, and you can, there's a bunch of workshops in there, but you can always search workshops by searching the keyword Woz U _ and then the topic that you're looking for. So this would be a JavaScript topic, so you could put JS. You can also put objects, or you could put this, or you could put FSW 101, for example, and that would generate all of the workshops that are tied to that, and you can find this one as well. If you have any issues finding it, just let me know and I can send you a direct link. but it won't be posted till by the end of the day. Also, if you have any questions that you forgot to ask or maybe that come up later, just send me a message on Slack. And if you'd like to set up an appointment with me, I'd be happy to do that. Again, just message me on Slack and we can schedule that. So with that being said, are there any last minute questions or comments? All right, well, thanks again for stopping by. And if you do have any feedback, just let me know. Have a good one.